Hello and welcome to this week's review of My Hero Academia Vigilantes, the anime series, and this week we're reviewing the episode titled Crossing Lines. We kick off this review, as we always do with these reviews, by talking about the positives and the headline positives. The big things I'll discuss in this particular review. I think this is an episode that did everything that I hoped that it would do. The action was on point, and I love the creepy tone it sets up, which I honestly think it just does brilliantly. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the most consequential moment in the My Hero Academia series. Yes, as this is the week, this is the episode, this is the moment where the hero killer Stain was born. Oh, what a wonderful ripping wheeze this is. It all came down to a fight in a dark alleyway with a horrific misunderstanding that would lead to a reign of terror by a new villain and a legacy that would stain Japan and the wider world possibly for decades to come. My god, I love how miserable the grand reveal in this episode is. I love how miserable it was in the manga. I love how miserable it is in the episode itself. The grand final confirmation that Stendhal was Stain all along! And that the grand motivation for Stendhal becoming Stain was, well, this. And in reality, the story that we heard, Stain's origin story that we heard earlier in My Hero Academia, was just a story, but more on that kind of stuff later on. This is probably the third major moment in the series up until this point that I was worried about how it would be executed in an anime. And I don't mean like this is the third most important, I just mean it like linearly. This was the third event I was worried about how it would get adapted as an anime, because there are just so many moving parts here that I felt that if it was poorly executed or some element one way or the other wasn't good enough, then yeah, this wasn't going to land. But hey, I think that this really is a fantastic episode. There were, of course, like I said, a lot of open questions, like, were they going to do all of this in one go? Were they going to do this whole fight sequence and the reveal and all that stuff in one episode? How certain moments in the episode were going to end up getting done, and how exactly they were going to square this with certain other readings of Stain's character, and how certain fans might react to this episode when they reveal exactly how Stain came to be what he was. But I think that this is done in as perfect a way as it possibly can be. I understand this might sound like damning with faint praise, but I think that, broadly speaking, the only issues I ultimately have with this one are stylistic ones that are very much different strokes for different folks kind of thing. It's stuff that is so subjective that I honestly can't hold against it. It's aspects of some of the design and the artwork which, for other people out there, I know they really do dig the artwork on this, and this is an episode that I think they're really going to dig. But for me, someone who read the manga, there are certain design choices that I think work better there than here. But even still, I still think this episode did a grand, fantastic job with how it put a lot of this stuff together. This is an ultimately very bleak episode when you get down to it. Yet our heroes ultimately survive, and they kind of save the day by virtue of saving Soga, but at the end of the day, this is an episode that in the wider canon, like I said towards the start of this review, is ultimately one of the most single consequential moments in the entire story. It almost makes you think what would have happened had this fight not have happened at all, or had the fight against Knuckle just to have gone differently. Maybe that's a video for a future time point, but I still think that even beyond just considering the wider canon of it, this is still a bleak episode, as it really gets into the minutiae of two big characters here. It gives us an idea as to who Stendhal really is and who Stain really is, even though we don't know the Stain at this point in the story, or at least we do if you know from the main series, but otherwise you don't. But beyond that, we do get that understanding of who Soga really is and how he became the man that he ultimately is in this moment. And the depiction of it is done in such a wonderfully, grotesquely put together and animated sequence, which, yes, I do think that certain aspects of it could have been done better visually, but I think that how it is still done is still great. I do love how these flashbacks, these little characters that he sees in these flashbacks, have this mask-like appearance on their face, something that's very similar to the design of Stendhal from a certain point of view, but it's all shown in this very creepy way. Yes, it's kind of a bit stereotypically creepy, but at the same time, it's executed well, I think, mostly due to the fact I think the audio here does a lot of the heavy lifting. Now, for clarity, I watched this subtitled, so how this went down with the dub might be different, but I imagine it'd be a similar kind of thing. Here, what they did was they distorted the voices in such a way that it felt as though they did maybe 2 or 3 different takes of that same bit of voice work, or at least edit it 3 different times, as you can hear like 3 different voices coming through at once. You hear just the normal acting of what you get in that scene, give or take a little bit of audio, reverb and echo, that kind of thing. Then you'd hear like a version of it that sounds a lot more angrier and sinister, and then you hear a version of it that sounds more like laughing and mocking. So you get this series of events, this montage of different moments where you'd have these moments where all these nasty things are happening to Soga, but you sometimes get it just in a straight, almost matter of fact, this is the tone and the feeling it had. Then you get the tone and feeling that it had in that moment, and the tone and feeling it has looking back to it. You get this full spectrum of emotion of 3 different points of view over the course of just a series of short lines for each little moment in this little montage. And I think that works fantastically well. I think that does go a long way to overcome, I think, what is ultimately not terribly great animation and art style, but still the actual acting of it, the production of it does do the heavy lifting and really adds that really uncanny nastiness back into it. And this whole series of events with Soga goes back to underline that running theme from the main series, that people can turn to villainy out of circumstances in their life more so than out of dogma. This is something that is to a degree similar to what we have with Gentle Criminal, who at the end of the day was pretty much just a high school dropout, whereas here with Soga, it's with having a problematic quirk and the social pressures that end up putting on him, leaving him rather isolated and alone, and ultimately setting him down a dark path of delinquency that then evolved into criminality. It gives us a better idea as to why he took Trigger in the first place, and it does, to a degree, recontextualize some of the things we saw in the past. This is particularly then underlined by the scene that we get earlier on, where he's meeting his friends at the hospital. The reason why he took Trigger, as we can tell from what he said in this conversation, the kind of questions that he asks his friends, is that he did this out of a desire for power and control over his life. We get from these conversations with his friends at the hospital that he's effectively asking, would you take Trigger again, and did you enjoy taking it? And whilst they ultimately say that, yeah, it was a fun ride, but at the end of the day, I'm fine as is, that creates a bit of a conflict in him, because when he was on Trigger, that ended up making him more powerful. It gave him more of a command and control of his destiny in that moment, in a way that he has been lacking in his life, and his friends ultimately don't want. He is a reluctant villain, if indeed you could call him a villain in the end, because, you know, let's be honest, the reason why he sticks out for this fight and smashes the trigger is to stop his friends getting targeted. As I say, these are people that ultimately were comfortable with just being the way that they are. They don't have this greater dogma to them. They're just kind of delinquents, just kind of a bit like petty criminals, if that, and they don't want to really go into villainy, really. That's not something they're interested in, and they themselves treat him as an equal. They treat him as a friend, and here is a moment where he's doing the same thing to them. He's paying that back, and it is somewhat tragically ironic that he doesn't see himself as being a hero or a role model really worth people's time, and that kind of stuff, given that it was only an episode ago where we had the moment with the fake Cyclops guy talking about, oh, there's this guy that used to go to our high school, he's really great and amazing, everyone looked up to him, he's this really great guy, and he's to them this heroic, manly, cool character, but to himself, he doesn't see that. He just sees himself as being this low life that isn't worth anyone's attention or worth anyone's time. But at least in this moment, he's going to do something that's going to make his life feel meaningful. And I do like how all this is put together. I think it's brilliantly well done for a character that up until this moment has just kind of been floating about in the background. Especially when I look back to my time reading it in the manga, where you'd go, at least from my point of view, when I was reading it, months without seeing this character, and then you'd get this great dive into who they are. I think that, if I'm to get critical though, I think that he gets into and out of his backstory too soon. Whilst on the one hand, I think it works well with the pacing of the scene, as I don't think it disrupts the episode too much, there's another part of me that feels as though it should have gone a little bit longer, get a little more stomach churning, at least within the realms of design. I don't think it needed to go grim or grimdark or nasty or anything like that, but I think that there needed to be a little bit of something there to just bring this out a little bit more, because this is a character that we haven't really seen that much of, so having this big dive into their hit backstory, it doesn't quite work for me, but at the same time, I think there's something within it that really does make it work. For this episode, at the very least, Soga is very much the emotional core of the episode. He's the one that, beyond anything else, we want him to pull through in this, because we realise that this guy, yes, he's a creep and he's a nasty piece of work, but he's ultimately that way because, like many characters in this series, he found himself falling down that path because of the society that he lives in. And that's something that I like, but I like it in a story point of view, but not in a real world point of view. You get the idea. If Soga is the emotional core, then Stendhal is very much the core of the story. Yeah, no shit, but you get the idea of what I'm saying here. He is the driving force with this episode, and I think that this is an episode that really does go a great way to just making them feel like a genuine, real presence, and it goes some way to giving us an idea as to who they are beyond Stendhal and Stain. I will say is that I think that the fight with him at the fake Avengers doesn't quite work for me, as again, this is a manga holdover thing. I think the manga did it better. I think that fight that he does with the guys in the room looked better because there's this greater sense of claustrophobia there. There's this greater sense of he's fighting in confined spaces, and it was conveyed to us through the panel work. Within the animation, that doesn't quite work, and we get the very typical thing in action animation with that anime or cartoons, where it's like swing, 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 and people falling over, which I didn't particularly like. And there's also the fact that beyond this, in the manga, it does give us a couple extra frames to establish that these guys are fake Avengers, and that the designs are a lot more overtly Avengers inspired, and that there is a bit where it explains why the fake Steve Rogers uses manhole covers, and that's his quirk and that's his power. Here we don't get that, which I'm sure that everyone's going to get the reference, and I don't think it loses anything by not leaning on it too much, but at the same time it just end up feeling like this is time in the episode that could have been spent building Stendhal as a character more so than a force of nature, but then at the same time building him out as a force of nature does make the big confrontation that he has later on the episode with him and Knuckle does a lot more thrilling, because now at this point you have a clear idea as to what these two characters can do. Even if you don't know that Stendhal is really Stain, you've seen the kind of thing that he's capable of. You know what he can do. It's been ultimately underlined rather definitively, so that when you get there, when you actually get to that moment where the two of them are fighting, it really does leave an impact. This is an episode that shows a rapid descent in Stendhal's mental state. This descent, what we see as a ascent in somewhat resembling some kind of anti-hero heroics, and then this descent into a world of darkness. I will say I do think there is a stage missing here that there may be needed an extra episode at least to have him in the background, or have him being this force in the background, because ultimately this is a 2-episode thing of who's this masked Marvel? Oh, it's Stain, which is a mystery that I think could have been drawn out a little bit longer, because ultimately there isn't much of a mystery as to who he really is. The biggest clue as to who he is up until this moment is the design of the katana. But beyond that, we get the confirmation early on in the episode that it's Stain, or at least someone with a very similar quirk. For me, I think there needed to be a little bit more is he, isn't he, but that's an adaptation thing, and it's not something I really think needs to be lent in too much. But I still think this episode as a whole entity does a great job of building him in a anti-hero sense, to give us an idea as to who he was before he made this descent into becoming a psychopath. And this episode really does, and one of the things I will say for it, it does help to, once again, underline just how that descent is manifested in a physical way. You go from Stendhal, this very clean, presentable, angular design, very pristine, very well measured, something that does, I think it's Deadshot is the character this ultimately is designed after from the DC comics or whatever. I'm whatever, I'm not a DC person, but you go from that to the more shabbier, grottier, grittier, grungier, almost Rorschach had he just spent a year in bloody Woodstock look to him, and you go from something that is very presentable in a very almost more cliched 90s grim, edgy comic book character way to one that's even more edgy and gritty. And I do like how we see that. I like how we get that transformation with him. This is the big fight with him, and Knuckle Dust is just fantastic. And I will admit, there is just a part of me that just wants to say it's fantastic, it's brilliant, and just gush over it, but it is a fight that really does. What I do like with this series is the times when you get two fighters, and this goes for the main series as well, who don't have similar quirks and don't have similar powers. I think that all too often with this series, and this is a complaint I have with superhero fiction more generally, is that you oftentimes get a hero, whomever they end up being, fighting what feels like a palette swap version of them, like the mirror universe equivalent of them. It's something that's definitely a problem with the Marvel movies, and it does feel like a problem with just a lot of comic books more generally, that you get a character that has a very specific skill set, and you have someone that they fight against who either has the exact same or they have the opposite, and that's about as far as the thing comes here. Here that isn't the case. You get someone who's very much a walking tank, a bruiser, an absolute force of nature, versus someone who's very agile, someone that has a lot of guile and flair and physicality and liveness to them that the other one doesn't have. So it ends up becoming this, as we see in the episode, this one-shot KO scenario, as both of them are ultimately capable of taking the other one down in next to no time. This episode, this whole sequence with Knuckle Duster and Stendhal is just this series of metaphors. Knuckle Duster crosses the line and breaks Stendhal's mask, which leads to Stendhal developing an ideology that's like cutting your nose off to spite your face, as that's what Stendhal does to complete his turn into Stain. Knuckle Duster tried to use this as a teaching moment, to tell Crawler that there are people out there that believe their own hype too much and keep getting into trouble, hint hint, and it can make it hard for heroes to save them, hint hint. But ultimately, Stain translates this to people who aren't as heroic as their stage persona is, or have a stage persona that's different to their real life, aren't heroes, or words to that effect, that anyone that isn't as much of a bold hero in their time just sitting around in their pajamas watching cartoons as they are going out and saving people from fires and burning buildings and terrorism or whatever, aren't real heroes. But ultimately his only way to determine whether or not they're real heroes isn't to study them and get to know them and to see if there's anything dodgy about them. For him, as we see in the main series, is determined by him fighting them to the death, with when he has a quirk that most people can't get around. So if you don't beat him, you aren't worthy, but if you do beat him, then he'll run away and hide like a little bitch. You can't really win against him unless you're the main character, or there's like 4 or 5 of you of taking him down, as we saw in the main series. I do love the creepy tone that this episode sets into certainly when we get into the second half of the episode, where again we get that gradual descent into madness with Stain. Once the moment that mask is broken and we just break, and Knuckle Duster breaks the idea of Stendhal, and that all is left is this psychopath that just wants to cut away at the world to bring some sense of justice back into his life and back into the world. And just how... Look, again, this is another thing that I was concerned as to how they would adapt in the manga, because in the manga, you see the text of what Stendhal is saying changing. It goes from very typical to a lot more angular and crazy and creepy looking. And this episode, it just becomes increasingly dark, visually dark, grim and bloody and nasty. See, then you get the moment in the episode where he does cut his own nose off. Because that's what he does, because he's a lunatic. Right, now this is a review that's going on a little bit far, so I will just say is that when it came to writing this review, I didn't have many negatives. And any negatives I have are ones that I've kind of already touched upon when it comes to matters of adaptation. The other issue that I have is that, and this is more of a case of just watching it subtitled, is that an issue that I have with a lot of subtitled anime is the fact I think that there's certain like background elements that don't need to be translated. Like, I don't need to know that the words painted on the road say stop. There's no significance there. I don't need to see the name of the pub that they're going into. Unless it's significant, I don't need to see it. You have the little moment when they're in the bar and it has the All Might poster saying no drinking. Okay, I didn't need to know that it was a no drink driving thing, right? I didn't need to see it was a no drink driving thing. But there was a part of me that kind of that he almost made it look like he was just saying drink driving or something along those lines. Like, because it brings... Oh, whatever. You get the idea. It's just how the subtitles are put into the thing. I'm not going to lean on it too long because it's not relevant to the whole discussion. I think the episode itself is still good. And any issues I do have it are very, very subjective. I don't really want to lean on them too much. With that said, let's get into the overview. And I think that this was a great episode. I think that, look, this is 2 separate episodes put into one, but you wouldn't know it from watching it. This is a brilliantly well put together episode. And yes, I think the pacing of this one could have been better, but that's more of a wider story issue. I think that more time could have been spent to just develop the mystery of who Stain is. Instead, what we end up getting is it being solved after an episode, which I don't think really works, but at the same time, if they let it out too long, it would have ended up feeling like he's going to become a major recurring character for the rest of the season at the very least, which, from having read this point on, well, you never know, they might change stuff, because they have changed stuff in the past. You might see a cameo appearance of him in the background at some point, but still, I think this is a fantastic episode. I think it's really well put together, and just one of my favourites thus far this series. Well, that's ended, however, let's get into Comment Corner! It's time for Comment Corner. 2 comments that I didn't write any direct replies to it, so now's your time for the reply. Anyway, comment first of all from Big X1 who says, I like this one a lot, but I feel that the season is rushed. I get skipping appearances doesn't the appearances matter episode, but I feel that it plays into your bit about perceptions as a theme in the series. Thank you for your comment, and we might still see it at some point. I mean, it's just a neat little thing they can have in the background too. If they really need a moment of filler, they can at least use something that's at least canon filler. I do think that at the very least they could have had it in to the very least, given the mystery of Stendhal and who they really are, more time to breathe, create a couple little background moments with him, but whatever, it is what it is. We'll probably see it at some point. Next up we have Scott TV Gamer who says, now this is what I want more of. New content, good changes. I think Koichi's college debut works better here, and as far as I could tell, no content was cut from the 2 episodes, the 2 chapter episodes that were adapted this week. And I hear that people say that there is a scene from a bonus chapter in the preview for the next episode, so they aren't skipping that completely. I suppose it depends. Actually, I have to look on it. I think that how they wrote the... Actually, you know what? Let me just double check that a second. Oh, yeah, it's because the episode... Yeah, now I understand it. It's because the final 3 episodes... the final... Yes. No, sorry. What I'm trying to say is that I'm looking at my copy of the manga right now, and this episode is ultimately an adaptation of 3.5 episodes from the manga, and that the half bonus episode is Mask. So yes, this is an adaptation of 3 episodes, 3.5 episodes effectively, and it does it bloody well. I thought for a second there that Scott TV Game was referring to appearances matter again, but it isn't. And it's fine. No, I think this is a great episode, and wow, we really are at the end of Volume 2 already. Wow. Anyway, I suppose we will have to see whether or not this is going all the way up to Sky Egg or not. We'll see. Anyway, thank you all for your comments. Leave comments down below, and I'll get back to you shortly. Thank you all for listening, and see you next time. Goodbye!
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!